Every year, the HACR Research Institute publishes landmark studies on both corporate best practices and the state of the Hispanic community around its 4 pillars. HACR research drives thought leadership and empowers stakeholders to create a more inclusive corporate America that both works with and invests in the Hispanic community. Every initiative encourages data-driven analysis and focuses on problem solving. These principles promote awareness of new developments and encourage the community to share new and innovative solutions. The jewel in the crown of HACR research is the highly anticipated annual Corporate Inclusion Index. No publication has more impact on decisions involving Hispanic diversity and inclusion in corporate America today. In order to recognize those companies that the index has proven to be the true leaders in Hispanic diversity and inclusion, the HACR Research Institute created the Corporate Inclusion Index Awards. These awards highlight those 5-star companies whose Hispanic inclusion efforts and strategies have yielded the absolute best results. For close to 35 years, HACR has led the way in supporting Hispanic inclusion in corporate America. Come be a part of the movement. Come be a part of our community.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Vanessa Bowling Adjavon, and I am the Senior Manager of Human Resources and Administration here at HACR. I have the pleasure of hosting today's webinar, and I'm very excited for today's discussion. In this fireside chat, we will learn more about the barriers that limit Hispanic inclusion in STEM professions and ways to mitigate these shortfalls moving forward. Before we begin, I would like to recognize today's sponsors, Merck and Prudential. Thank you, Merck, for your continued partnership and support of HACR. Please enjoy this video highlighting that commitment provided by Merck.
Hello, my name is Celeste Warren, and I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Merck. Merck is proud to be a sponsor for the HACR webinar entitled, Why is STEM So Important?, which will highlight barriers that limit the inclusion and progression of Hispanic STEM professionals. At Merck, we have committed to increasing the acquisition, development, and advancement of our colleagues in the Latino and Hispanic community, because we know that without a strong representation of all of the dimensions of diversity within our workforce, we cannot achieve our mission of saving and improving not just some lives, but all lives. If the United States is to remain competitive, we need children from every ethnic and economic background prepared for jobs and potential careers in the STEM disciplines. With the country's growing Latino and Hispanic population, we face a paradox of challenge and opportunity. By participating in this webinar, we hope you will expand your awareness on this subject and, very importantly, create interventions to remove barriers and obstacles. Once again, thank you, HACR, for allowing all of us at Merck to participate in this very important webinar.
Prudential has been a longtime partner of HACR, and we thank them for their continued support. Please enjoy this video highlighting Prudential's commitment to diversity and inclusion.
There's an old proverb that says, many hands make light work. One company has always believed that many hands also make good work. It began when Prudential founder John Dryden pioneered life insurance, bringing security and dignity to working families. Through depression and Dust Bowl, Prudential kept farmers afloat and families in their homes. We marched with the nation as it went to war, and then as it paved, powered, and towered its way into the future. These are our hands, our work, heart, and soul. After cities burst into flames, Prudential worked to help put life back together, brick by brick, job by job, promise made by promise kept, standing tall through '87 and 9/11 and 2008. where waves of shock were met with a response, solid as a rock. These are our hands, our work, heart, and soul. Focusing not just on financial outcomes, but personal ones, like planning for fuller lives when people are living longer than ever, keeping families intact instead of being in tatters, helping protect assets to make fighting an illness a fair fight, assuming risk for companies so they can keep growing, while keeping the pension, a secure retirement, and financial independence as part of the American dream. Finding investment opportunity that turns old downtowns into new boom towns, developing nations into developed economies, and the world's markets into an instrument that makes the world better for all. These are our hands, our work, heart, and soul. In markets where the face of wealth is changing in color, gender, and generation, with advice delivered face to face and heart to heart. In communities invested with attention, optimism, and energy, so that businesses open, music plays, hope springs, and children know that they are always loved. These are our hands, our work, heart, and soul. And these are our people. More than 49,000 professionals worldwide, answering the real-life challenges of millions of others from every background and decade of life, knowing that the greatest return on their effort is strengthening the society we all share. These are our hands, our work, heart, and soul. And we welcome whatever challenge is next.
Thank you again to Merck and Prudential for your continued support. HACR's annual symposium and executive programs will be virtual this year. This inaugural virtual event will be taking place on September 29th. So mark your calendars and please follow us on social media to receive important details about this and future events. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel at any time. Questions are only visible by our team, and questions will be addressed throughout the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to all webinar registrants and posted to our archive page at HACR.org. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to HACR's Executive Vice President and COO, Dr. Lisette Garcia, to tell you about herself and today's panelists. Lisette?
Thanks, Vanessa. It's my pleasure to be here with you today, guiding this conversation on STEM. You know, when we think about STEM, it's not just coding and lab coats. It's the underpinning of manufacturing and food production and healthcare and so much more that, frankly, we take it for granted, but surely we can't live without it. STEM is important because our world depends on it, the economy depends on it, our general well-being depends on it. It's all backed by science, technology, engineering, and math. So you might be wondering, if STEM is so important, it's so necessary, then why do we have to keep talking about it? You might be saying, this is the 25th webinar that features STEM in the title. We get it, STEM is important, so let's move on. And therein lies the rub. The collective we haven't quite gotten it yet. So joining me today to further our understanding on STEM and why it's important to our community and others is Dr. David Ortiz, Senior Vice President for Operations at the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, or HACU. In this role, Dr. Ortiz is responsible for the operations of HACU and the implementation of policies, goals, and objectives to advance the mission of the association. Dr. Ortiz's research and work on Hispanic higher education has been recognized by a number of organizations, including the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanics and the Texas Association of College and University Student Personnel Administrators. Dr. Ortiz earned his PhD in Higher Education Administration from Indiana University Bloomington and his Master's in Education and Bachelor's in Sociology from Texas A&M University, College Station. Please welcome Dr. Ortiz. Also joining us for this important conversation is the CEO of the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, or SHPE, Raquel Tamez. As the CEO, Ms. Temez guides SHPE's mission of helping the Hispanic community realize its potential through careers in STEM. Since 2017, she has brought a renewed energy to SHPE, expanding national programs, services, and resources offered to more than 11,000 members across 270 plus chapters nationwide. She envisions a future where Hispanics are recognized as leading scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and innovators. Ms. Temez is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and St. Mary's University School of Law. Please welcome Raquel Tamez. So thank you both for joining us today for this conversation on STEM and helping us and our audience to understand why it's so important. Before we kind of jump into it, I'll share some stats. It wouldn't be a discussion with me if I didn't share some statistics about what was happening. And I want to start by sharing some things happening in terms of underrepresentation. And despite sort of this increased demand for talent that we know exists in STEM fields, there are many communities in the United States that continue to lack sufficient access to STEM jobs. And in fact, in 2018, the Pew Research Center issued a report where Hispanics were shown to be significantly underrepresented in the STEM workforce, given their relative proportion to the overall population in the United States. And according to that report, Hispanics hold only 7% of STEM jobs, less than half of their size in the US workforce. That same report also showed that Hispanics experience differential outcomes in terms of promotion and advancement opportunities. Though understanding the root causes for those differences has proven to be challenging, I think our conversation today is an attempt to kind of shed some light into what's happening and to really try and unpack some of the things that we've seen over the last few years in terms of access to education, access to jobs in the Hispanic community as it pertains to STEM. So let's talk a little bit about education first. When we look at certain indicators like PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, or the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development data, the US ranks low in math and science performance. And when you couple that with data from the National Math and Science Initiative that shows that only 36% of all high school grads are ready to take a college-level science course, the outlook is bleak for the US, for students, for STEM. And when we add additional structural barriers that we know are more likely to impact Latino students, like access to courses, to the materials they need, to qualified teachers, etc., the situation appears to be even more dismal for our students. So what can we do? Tell us a little bit about what your organizations are doing.
Lisette, would you like me to start? Okay.
Yes, Raquel, please start.
All right. So Raquel Tamez, the CEO of SHPE, the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, and thank you for the landscape, Lisette. And you described a systemic issue. Systemic issue then requires a systemic solution, a holistic, integrated solution. So what that means is that we actually need to communicate amongst organizations, amongst corporate, government, and organizations like SHPE, nonprofit, the nonprofit sector. SHPE, for one, is doing work along the entire STEM pathway, and we partner with other organizations along that pathway. We have one program in particular, Noche de Ciencias, Science Night, or Dia de Ciencias, Science Day, where we bring in entire families, really to address the two main barriers that we see for Hispanics entering STEM, and that is awareness and access. So I think our parents have heard of STEM. They might have an understanding that it's important, but they might not fully understand what it is. And so through our programming, hands-on programming and STEM activities, where we have student members and professional members and Hispanic leader role models there doing hands-on STEM activities, we are bringing that awareness not just to an interested high school student, but his younger brothers, his or her younger brothers and sisters, and more importantly, his or her parents. Because at the end of the day, if a Hispanic child is going to go to higher education, he's going to go to university, the parents are going to be involved in that decision. And so it's important to get the parents involved and get them aware of what STEM is, and not just address the opportunities, right? Like, hey, you can get this type of job and this type of income and these types of benefits. Yes, that's important, but the possibilities in STEM. So not just the opportunities, but the possibilities, and really widening the aperture, the vision for our Hispanic families, and ultimately, and more greatly, our Hispanic community. Then there's the access to STEM and STEM education. We also address that through our community engagement program, Noche de Ciencias, Dia de Ciencias, by really informing parents and interested students on how to actually apply for university, apply for financial assistance, because those processes are oftentimes overly complicated and daunting, especially for first-gen students like myself and many of us who didn't have parents who went to university, didn't know how to apply to school, didn't know how to apply for financial aid or scholarships for that matter. And so it's important to demystify all of that for our parents and make it less scary and unduly burdensome. So through our programming and mainly our community engagement program, we do that for the Hispanic community and really start to increase the numbers of those students that are interested in STEM, because there is interest in our community amongst our young people in STEM. Now we just need to lower the barriers or neutralize those barriers for them. And I like to think that SHIP is a big part of that.
Thank you, Raquel. I'm going to go ahead and hop in here. And first off, let me say thank you to AssetBased for inviting HACU to be a part of this presentation. And I'm sure what everyone on the call or the webinar is saying right now is, who's that guy that's on my screen? Because he looks nothing like the person in that picture. And yes, this is what living in a pandemic will do. Looking a little older and a little more bearded is exactly what happens now that we're 4 or 5 months into stay-at-home orders. But again, thank you, Asset and Raquel and Ship for being a part of the panel today. A little bit about HACU. I want to make sure before I get into some of the specifics, and Lisette, you'll appreciate this, your reference to data. I'm the same way. I used to say, nice to meet a fellow data geek, but that's a pejorative in one sense. So let me say, it's nice to have a fellow data beast on this webinar with us. You too, Raquel. So HACU represents the over 500, in fact, 539 Hispanic serving institutions. So I am going to beast out on you for just a moment, so you understand the way that HACU fits in this hemisphere of STEM education and Hispanic higher education, right? So Hispanic serving institutions are institutions that enroll 25% or more Hispanic and Latino Latinx students on their campus, right? And we know that for the past 10 years, the number of those institutions have been increasing every year by 30, right? So it's not a stagnant number. There hasn't always been 539 HSIs. They have been increasing over time. Now, why it's important for me to engage this conversation about STEM with a background of HSIs, it's because 67%, so about 2/3 of all Hispanics, and Latinos, and Latinx students who are enrolled in higher education, the near 3.8 million of those are in HSI. Right? So in terms of a pipeline, an opportunity to make a real impact, we have a captured community of would-be scholars, would-be STEM students in these HSIs. And that includes four-year institutions, community colleges. Right? So in terms of that, some of the work that HACU has been doing is we have an advocacy component of the organization that is actively engaged in helping to ensure that those 539 HSIs have adequate funding, and more specifically, adequate STEM funding to make an impact in graduation, make an impact in developing the next generation workforce in STEM. So this past December, December 2019, HACU had an opportunity to do what's called a flyover with a number of other minority serving institution associations similar to HACU to encourage Congress to pass or to review a 10-year-old legislation that funded minority serving institutions in the area of STEM. Now that legislation expired last year, and our hopes were that we could at least extend it another year, maybe two. Well, because of the collective work of national associations like HACU, we not only got it back on the table at the administration of the White House to vote on it, but in fact, they made it a mandatory spending in perpetuity. So that money is there. HACU has worked with the National Science NSF, the National Science Foundation, to create an HSI-specific funding pattern. And to date, $85 million have been allotted to HSI since 2017. So HACU is very much in the mix because we know in order to empower Hispanic serving institutions and the nearly 2 million, actually over 2 million Latinx students who attend those institutions, they need the proper funding, they need the opportunity to create innovative new programs to educate their faculty. So we're excited about that type of work. And in addition to not just the advocacy component, we have a variety of programmatic issues that we take up. We have a corporate internship program that has been successful. It's part of the HACU National Internship Program, which includes corporate and federal. And since its inception, we've had over 13,000 placements with federal agencies and corporations. And I'll talk a little bit later about the importance of experiential education and corporate internship programs like that. But I think the key is to know that HACU has been working since its inception in 1986 to ensure that there are adequate funding mechanisms in place. Specifically in the last 10, 15 years, we've looked at STEM, but also to create programmatic opportunities for our students who attend those institutions.
So thanks, David, and thanks, Raquel, for sharing a little bit about what your organizations are doing. And you know, maybe we can transition a little bit to talk about degree completion, right? So understanding a little bit about the background, understanding a little bit about, you know, not only providing sort of the base education for our students, but also for providing that education to their parents and to their family, which is also crucial in dealing with increasing Hispanic representation in STEM. And I think you know, there's sort of the next layer, right? So once we cover that aspect of it, sort of the introductory piece, there's the next layer. And I think, you know, we've all seen the news lately. We've all seen the reports talking about how for the first time ever, Latinos are the leading group among prospective freshmen who've accepted admission into the UC system, which is, if not the largest, one of the largest in the country. And in general, we're seeing more Hispanics going to college, and graduation rates are rising. And when we look specifically at STEM, we know that when it comes to declaration of major, Hispanics are equally as likely as their white peers to declare STEM majors. But something happens between the declaration of that major and the degree completion, because what we see is a drop off in terms of the number of Hispanics who are declaring STEM majors, but then ultimately finishing with a degree in something else. So would you like to share maybe your thoughts, a little bit of insight into what's going on there, and perhaps what your organizations are doing to try and sort of stem that drop off? No pun intended, of course.
So I'll go ahead and start off, Lisette. And I think what you're talking about is this, it's the issue of persistence, right? I think it's incredibly sort of interesting and exciting, and I'm cautiously optimistic when I see the numbers of Hispanics graduating high school at higher numbers, entering university at higher numbers, declaring STEM or some kind of STEM study at higher numbers. The issue is persistence or lack of persistence. And mainly it's because of the lack of affordability to attend university. And oftentimes, there's research out there that our Hispanic families don't necessarily want to take out loans. There's the burden and the complexity of applying for financial assistance. There is the same thing for applying for scholarships. A lot of our students in the Hispanic community also are first gen, and I mentioned that earlier. And so there's not necessarily that parent or that caregiver that can provide guidance to that student on what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and then to support them thereafter. Many of our student members have to work while also attending school, and that takes away from their studies and really being involved in their extracurricular activities. And then let's not ignore the fact that many of our Hispanic students identify in many different ways, ethnically, gender, sexual orientation. So there's that whole intersectionality thing, and then the microaggressions. So our campuses actually have a lot of work to do when it comes to making campuses more inclusive. So if you have a first-gen student, for example, who is at a university where there aren't necessarily a lot of students that look like him or her, and then they're having to work and not necessarily get involved in extracurricular activities or study groups, there is that those extra pressures on that student that then really weighs in and factors into whether or not that student is going to continue to attend university and or attend or continue with his or her declared STEM degree. There's no denying that engineering courses are extremely challenging. And so when you have all of these extra factors to consider, those are things that we can't ignore when a student decides to change majors or just to drop out altogether. What's really problematic about that is then that student is now delayed because they may have spent 1 or 2 years at university. But not only that, now they may very well be in debt. So we at SHPE try and support those students, first-gen students, underrepresented minorities, primarily Hispanics, with our SHPE chapters. We have student chapters at many universities. We have almost 300 chapters across the U.S. We actually have chapters in about 2/3 of the HSIs. Hispanic Serving Institutes. And one of the goals that I've set for my team is to actually have a SHPE chapter at every HSI. So we're looking at least 539 chapters because there's 539 HSIs. So SHPE, and no doubt, if you speak to any of our SHPE members, they'll say, SHPE is, supported me throughout my academic career. They really were the game changer for me. And I'd like to think that we do a very good job. And we still need to do more, no doubt. There's still a lot more that we could do, but we've been doing this since 1974. And I oftentimes say that we're the best kept secret in STEM, and we can no longer be the best kept secret in STEM. We need to partner with organizations like HACU and ASSET and other organizations to really create critical mass numbers of Hispanics entering STEM so that we can change the narrative for our community.
So the question is a good one. It's a very realistic question in terms of what's happening today in higher education, Hispanic higher education, and Hispanic STEM education. Yes, so there's good news. We are seeing the enrollment of Hispanic and Latinos in higher education at unprecedented numbers. In fact, it has nearly tripled since the year 2000 in the number of Latinos engaged in higher education. If you go back and you look at the data of those that are enrolling in STEM academic programs, it actually outpaces all other groups proportionately in terms of their enrollment. So that's impressive, right? Now, I think we have to be careful how we phrase and put this question out there in terms of the fact that that's the good news. The not so good news is that graduation is not being proportionate to enrollment in these degree programs. Now, what I say we need to be careful is if we look at it from that macro perspective, it's easy to engage this conversation about completion from a deficit model, right? In other words, that there's a problem that's not working out here, and we need to do something to correct it. What I would argue and I'd suggest to us is to begin to look at this from the asset-based perspective. So let's look at those programs. Let's look at those universities that are actually doing a very good job of increasing graduation, not just doing a great job about enrollment. So, for example, I think about one of the HACU member institutions, and let's say you brought in the state of California. Raquel and I being native Texans originally, we always have that that little competition, but you got to give props. You got to give it up for some institutions like California State University, Stanislaus. That's an example of an institution that used federal funding, that funding that I talked about earlier, the Title V funding, STEM funding, to actually go back to the university, take these dollars and look at the questions that you were asking just a few minutes ago. Why is it that there's a drop-off in terms of continuation in the STEM degree program? So that's an example of an institution that looked at it from a very critical perspective and applied programmatic funding from the Department of Education. I'm sorry, in this case, it's from the National Science Foundation to make a difference. So a few of the key takeaways, I think, from an example like that is when we look at what's happening. So I think that's what your question was, right? So what's happening? Why are we losing them in these areas? We need to look at things like gateway courses, because these are students that are coming out on paper qualified to be in the STEM program, but there's something happening. It could be that there is a lack of a truly proper presentation of the academic rigor in high school. So universities then have to respond with the creation of gateway courses, courses that can actually serve to truly prep them and prepare them for courses like organic chemistry, which I think anecdotally many of us will say if you can get past organic chemistry in your science coursework, then you're in pretty good shape. You can handle everything else. So if we look at gateway courses that can help make that difference, that's one aspect. That's one of those barriers. And I think the other one is we need to look at the faculty, right? So again, a school like Stan State used that federal funding to re-envision the training and the preparation of their faculty, because this may come as a surprise or not. Their faculty did not reflect the Latino students in their classroom, right, in terms of ethnicity. So retraining the faculty in ways to properly engage in appropriate pedagogy, right, teaching methods to help those faculty be able to reach students and be able to understand the cultural components that a student brings into the classroom are just some of the examples that we can take from institutions and programs that are doing it and doing it well. So that would be my takeaway. The comments that I would leave us with here is, well, if we break this down and we look at it from asset-based opportunity, then that is the best way to approach this. Now that's going to go from higher education, but also in the corporate world, which I'll address a little bit later in terms of best practices and strategies that we can use to try and make a difference in terms of reducing attrition in the STEM careers within corporations. But an asset-based approach to me would be the one recommendation, and seeing what works and seeing how we can replicate it either on our own college campus or our own corporate entity.
Yes, Lisette, if I may, I would just add, I would agree with the asset-based approach, which organizations, what institutions are doing it well, what can we learn, what are the best practices there, what's working, what's not working. Excelencia in Education, gives out awards on those institutions that are in fact doing well. I want to give out a shout to Dr. Emily Allen. She sits on the National Board of Directors at SHIP, and she is the Dean of Engineering at Cal State. So excellent school system and university. I also want to comment too that one of the things that SHIP is doing, some of you may be familiar with SHIP's Industry Partnership Council. So that's our think tank of 50 of the best companies in the world on the corporate side. Well, we are now launching the Academic Partnership Council. So this is the council of universities So think of the deans of engineering at universities now becoming a brain trust for SHIP, to work with SHIP, and SHIP being that convener and that connector between corporate and academic institutions, because I think some of you may agree that there seems to be a disconnect between what's happening and what the universities are producing as far as graduates and what the industry actually needs. So you see companies like Google now on campuses, so that there is that influence on the types of courses that students need to take and the types of certifications and credentials and experience that they're going to need. So no doubt the gateway courses, absolutely agree with you, David. We really need to emphasize amongst our community that math courses, that math in fact is a third language for some of our students. If they're bilingual, if they are well versed in math, that is a language. Math is a universal language. So why can't our students, why can't our kids in our Hispanic community be multilingual? English, Spanish, and math, and coding. Coding is a language. Other things that SHIP is doing is we actually have a faculty development symposium. So David, you talked about the faculty at the university and how it's not representative of the students that might be on campus at an HSI, for example. No doubt. So faculty development symposium is something that SHIP does at its convention, and it's really to support those pre-tenured professors to become actual tenured professors. These are diverse professors, and we support them into their tenureship. We have a dean's roundtable. We're having conversations with the deans, and then I mentioned to the Academic Partnership Council. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen in order to really change the script here on what's happening with Hispanic students declaring STEM degrees and then not actually graduating with those degrees, if at all.
So I think you're both making some really excellent points here. And I think that there is certainly a lot of similarity between what we see happening in the educational system and ultimately what we see then happening in workplaces, right? The work that we do at HACR often focuses not only on how companies recruit their talent, and I think it's fairly safe to say that most companies have an excellent handle on how to recruit. Where it becomes a little bit more challenging for them is in the retention piece, right? And that's not all that dissimilar from what we've been talking about in terms of education, right? We see the recruiting aspect or the declaration of the major sort of being something that we're good at, but the degree completion or the retention piece sort of struggles a little bit. And so I think, we need to try and understand a little bit better what's happening in some of these institutions, right? So what's happening in the educational system? Is it something just as you've been describing? Is it about sort of different circumstances, different or competing interests? Is there also, something else at play here, right? Are we seeing sort of manifestations of other people's expectations about the kinds of jobs that are appropriate for Hispanics, for example? And then what is the relationship between that and what's happening in the workplace? And our audience today is largely represented of corporations. And so I've been seeing some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience as they're asking, and I want to kind of try and address maybe one or two. So there's a question that's come in and it says, what are your recommendations for how one, as an individual, a person in a workplace, can help the Hispanic community in promoting, mentoring, supporting STEM efforts that are happening around them? So what advice might you offer to that person?
Well, I can say one thing about an individual's power. Right? One of the things that I have noticed in the 2.5 years that I've been a part of HACU is that where we have been successful is when we've had an advocate on the inside. Right? An advocate that says, look, I'm committed to this and I can work to help communicate to either our board, our department, or to colleagues the importance of this idea of STEM education or diversity and inclusion. Because it's not that easy for that to happen unless you have an advocate or a group of advocates. And even more importantly is that you have to have your top level administration be a part of it. right? So I would say that it is possible for an individual to be that advocate, to be that person who engages associations, groups like SHPE, HACU, ASSER, and that's a starting point, because there's great power in one, but that's the start, and there can be great power as a collective. So I wouldn't ever tell anyone don't be fearful to speak up, but be persistent in terms of asking how I can get engaged. And the folks on this webinar here today, that's what we make ourselves available, because great opportunities happen with that first call, that first meeting. And so we're here to support in that sense. But also, if I could pivot just a bit, Lisette, because you were saying how there's a number of corporate folks who are on board here, and questions about how to retain the talent in the organization. So I would say that it's somewhat comparable to what we see happening from Latino students who are entering college, leaving college, and starting the workforce. And what I mean by this is we battle constantly this imposter syndrome, right? So we have high school students who aren't thinking about college, or they're not even thinking about STEM. They might be thinking about, well, I can go into education because I know teachers, or I can go into business because I know business is a potential major. But they don't think about becoming a physicist. Don't think about becoming a scientist, an engineer, a demographer who uses science and data. So at least at HACU, what we've done is create a series of university tours. So we partner with school districts, we partner with universities that engage students in what is experiential learning. And that's going to be really the bottom line common denominator of what I'm going to talk about for the next 60 seconds or 90 seconds, is you have to introduce the student initially to this idea of that, yes, they can. Si se puede, I can be it at the university, and it's by exposure. The longer you're exposed to something, the more comfortable and familiar you become with it. So then you get them into the university, and you have these programs like I mentioned earlier at Cal State, Stanislaus, that introduces students, that builds confidence, that builds a sense of ownership. But then when you graduate and you go into the workforce, you go into a company, and it's starting all over again. If you're the only Latinx person, or the only person of color, this imposter syndrome can begin to creep up again. And so we did a great job of recruiting you, but now you're left kind of to your own devices. So that's why I think the importance of experiential education is key. So in our case at HACU, the emergence of our corporate internship program, our federal internship programs, gives students a safe way to get more exposure and familiarity and feel less like an imposter in a real work environment. And so I think that's a key part of this, is getting corporations having robust partnerships with associations that focus on Hispanic higher education to create a pipeline of talent and acquisition that is going to be diverse, that's going to look like, quite frankly, the clients that they're serving. I think I went over 90 seconds, but I just wanted to make that piece clear, that it's experiential opportunities, and they have to be genuine, and you have to be creative in your approach to bringing that talent in. And also, if you are recruiting them, know that there's options to recruit year-round, not just the summer. There's fall, there's spring opportunities, but the other part of that is we have to work with the student to let them know, hey, go work this summer at Google. Don't work at the family restaurant, or don't work at a place where you've worked at since high school. That's not going to give you the type of experiential learning and experience that you need. And that's a struggle, but that's why internship programs like HACUs, or those maybe like SHPEs, that are going to be key to getting students introduced to the workforce and feeling less like an imposter, and feeling like they know what they're up against and what the opportunities are.
Raquel, do you think that maybe you could add some, additional insight into other impactful ways that we can get Hispanics into STEM jobs? I mean, David's been talking about sort of some of these cultural barriers, right? Like an understanding and working through imposter syndrome. Back when I was studying, we talked about stereotype threat as well, in addition to imposter syndrome. So can you share some insight into another way that potentially we can get more Hispanics into STEM jobs and in that career pipeline, right? Because we know that it's not just about the job, but it's also about what that job means in terms of your professional advancement and later opportunity.
Sure. I'll just comment a little bit on what's been said so far. I think you mentioned, that organizations, companies have recruiting down, and I would respectfully disagree. I think that there are lots of opportunities for companies to do much better on how they're recruiting, where they're recruiting, what criteria they're considering when recruiting. And no doubt, once an organization shores up its recruiting, then it is about retention, and not just about retention, but how do you actually ensure that the work environment, that the culture at that company is inclusive, and then how do you actually advance diverse talent? How do you acknowledge that diverse talent? How do you engage that diverse talent? And then how do you actually promote that diverse talent? So no doubt the mentors are important, the role models, the career sponsors, advocacy. I'm promoting the idea of capital IDEA. So not just inclusion, diversity, and equity, it's also about advocacy. And David mentioned advocacy. So to the extent that an individual wants to know what they can do, if you're a diverse professional, if you're Hispanic, you need to be excellent at what you're supposed to be doing at work, right? You have to be excellent, be an excellent engineer. And then I think it's communication skills, advocacy skills, but first and foremost, being excellent at what you do, and then learning how to communicate effectively and advocating for yourself, getting involved in the ERGs. And if you're an ally, same thing, get involved with your ERGs. One thing that I believe that organizations, companies need to do better at is really rewiring their systems. There's a lot of organizations, a lot of companies that are well-intentioned. They appreciate and understand that diversity is important and inclusion is important, but they actually need systemic change within their companies. They need to rewire their systems in order to rewire behavior. I also believe that what we see a lot of lately is tone at the top. You have the CEO promoting and pounding their chest that diversity inclusion is important and equity is important. You have the ERGs sort of at the grassroots levels doing a lot of activity. We actually need to mind the middle. Middle management matters. They're the ones on the front lines making these decisions that are part of the system that needs to be rewired. So we really need to mind the middle managers that are making the decisions to not necessarily hire the diverse talent. And then if a CEO is going to advocate for diversity, inclusion, and equity, then rewiring the system and holding their managers accountable to that diversity and inclusion. Because if you don't have metrics and hold middle management accountable, then you just have pipe dreams. You just have aspirations, and they're not actually moving the needle when it comes to diversity and inclusion in a meaningful way. So I'll stop there, but there's certainly other things that organizations can do. Mainly, if you're going to mind the middle and your CEO is on board and your C-suite's on board, and you have your ERGs on board too, then how do we make every individual an inclusive leader? We all want to be leaders, and you don't necessarily need a job title. Like, I'd like to think I'm a leader that has a job title of CEO. So how do we make everyone within the organization an inclusive leader? It's about being committed to diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's about being courageous. It's about being cognizant of your own bias. It's about being curious about other cultures, asking catalytic questions, and being an advocate and an influencer. It's about being culturally intelligent about other cultures and intersectionality. It's about being collaborative. So how do we teach those skills to everyone in the organization so that you move a company on that maturity model from, you know, being legally compliant because you have to hire X number of diverse professionals to programmatic diversity inclusion, to tone at the top, to actually a holistic and integrated inclusive work environment and culture. That's what we need to move towards. And it's really about those 6 traits that I mentioned and bringing that to everyone within the organization.
Thank you, Raquel, for sharing that. And you know, everyone knows we have prepared questions for these webinars always, but I think I want to pivot, and rather than address the ones that we were meaning to discuss, take a few from the audience, because we have about 6 or so minutes left for the discussion, and there are 2 that I think that have come in that are pertinent for our discussion. And I'm going to start with one that is in particular about COVID and the impact that COVID is having on all kinds of institutions, but in particular, as we're sort of thinking about this discussion and thinking about the different topics we've covered today, is education. And when we look at some of the characteristics of our communities that are low income, that don't have access to technology or internet or Wi-Fi, to be able to take virtual classes, you know, it is quite daunting and extremely scary for parents, for kids, for what this means sort of moving forward. So, you know, I'd ask if you have any thoughts on, you know, how we can make the best out of this situation.
So I'll say one thing that is near and dear to my heart about what has happened recently. The federal government came out and they did establish the CARES Act, and X amount of dollars was allocated to universities to help all students and the most needy students to be able to manage this issue with COVID. One incredible contradiction that the irony is not lost on me is that our undocumented students in higher education, the DACA students, were counted as a part of the enrollment at those institutions, which was then used to allocate funding. Yet the federal government, more specifically the Department of Education, came out and said that they were exempt from being able to access those funds because of their status. So that right there shows some of the contradictions in the efforts that we tried to do, which are well-intentioned. Well, I think they're well-intentioned, yet a large, significant portion of undocumented students who are largely, not entirely, but largely Latinx students were unable to have those funds to help them be able to manage and ride this wave of what's happening with COVID-19. We know that many of these communities that these students are at aren't going to have internet access. What we've seen is high schools, not so much universities, but the public schools who've opened up free access. So it's, you know, it's here, at least here in Texas, it is fascinating to see people parked in a parking lot. So they have Wi-Fi access to be able to complete the work that they're doing. So there's tremendous inequality in there. And we have to be cognizant that that's going to impact what's happening in education. You know, the longer this happens, you know, the more we are at risk of basically losing some of our students in not just STEM, but in higher education. And let's not also forget that for those that are first generation and whose parents are overrepresented in the service industry, it's a service industry that's been hit really hard. So we're not just talking about a student being able to access his or her homework or classwork online. We're talking about the survival of some of these families based on the fact that they are overrepresented in the service industry. So it's coming at them from all other directions, and it is something that we watch closely, and we have worked, at least HACU, with institutions to help them understand how to handle the COVID dollars and be able to distribute them. We get asked that question a lot in the beginning, but it's not going to go away. And we have to constantly, as Raquel said, be advocating for those students for those measures. I don't know that there's a simple answer, but we can't just let it sit on the back burner.
Raquel, any thoughts?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that no doubt the impact of COVID is very real. It's very real for my student members and members overall, but certainly the student members, many of them had to leave campus and go back to homes to the extent that they had homes, to the extent that they were even welcomed in their homes, especially for my LGBTQ members who may not necessarily be welcomed home, or going home to parents that have lost jobs as well. And so now we have student members that are no longer on campus. Their housing is questionable or turned upside down. They may have lost on-campus jobs. They've lost that income. To the extent that they may have had financial assistance, they're now having to use the financial assistance for food and housing, and not just for themselves, but for their families. They're having to use scholarship dollars for that as well. SHIP created an all-in relief emergency fund for those students, and we've been able to help a significant number. One way that the individuals on this on this webinar, on this call, can help is through financial assistance, through stipends, through scholarships, and we have those set up at SHIP, and other organizations have those set up at SHIP as well. So no doubt there's a digital divide when it comes to having access to Wi-Fi and just hardware and software for our students. But I want to remain cautiously optimistic as well. We're having this discussion. I think with all the social unrest, we are experiencing a reckoning, and it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us. Here we have HACR, HACU, and SHIP on this webinar. And think of all of the amazing individuals that are representing all of these global companies and academic institutions. I think it's an opportunity to pause and to listen to one another and to see how we can come together and actually have a greater impact together, as opposed to doing all of these disparate things. SHIP no doubt does certain things very well, but imagine the extraordinary things that SHIP and HACU can do, SHIP and HACR, or HACR, HACU, and SHIP, right? And other organizations. This is an opportunity for us to start to rewire those systems and not go back to the economy, the old economy. It can be a new economy and a new way of educating ourselves and ensuring that our students are educated. But we have to address some certain things first, like the digital divide. And I think that I believe that the U.S. is an amazing country, and I'm so grateful to be here and to be a part of it, that we can achieve things together. And this is one effort towards that, is bringing awareness and figuring out how we're going to have a critical mass impact sooner versus later.
And I think on that note, we'll end. I think that's a great way for us to end, just thinking about the opportunity that these challenges present to us and how we move forward. So thank you, Raquel and Dr. Ortiz, for taking the time to talk with me today. I'm going to turn it back over to Vanessa to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you again to today's sponsors, Merck and Prudential, for their continued support and partnership. It's because of all that you, it's because of all of you that our organization continues to grow and thrive. And thank you to you all, our attendees, for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this discussion. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Please remember to follow us on social media to receive important details about our upcoming virtual events. The webinar schedule is also available on our website at HACR.org. And please remember to complete the survey that will automatically pop up once the webinar has ended. Thank you, and we will see you again soon.